The room didn't just quiet, it braced. Marble swallowed the last whispers as the camera lights softened to a hum and every eye cut toward the lone microphone. A figure stepped into that airless stillness, shoulders set, notes tight in one hand like a promise. Representative Jasmine Crockett. No entourage, no theatrics, just a steady breath and a gaze that refused to blink. Across from her, high on the bench beneath the coffered ceiling and the American eagle's shadow, Justice Brett Kavanaugh leaned back with practiced ease. The faintest smirk perched like punctuation on a sentence he was sure he'd already won. He'd laughed once already, a short, confident sound that bounced off stone and said, "I've been here longer than you." He expected the room to laugh with him again. He expected the script to hold. What happened next rewrote the script. Before a single word left her mouth, tension traveled row by row like a fuse, catching coats and pens and the knuckles of clasped hands. Reporters, already living 2 minutes ahead for the headline, froze their fingers above keyboards. C-SPAN's red tally marks glowed. The 9 justices sat in their elevated calm, but you could feel the center of gravity tilt toward the podium. Crockett's chin lifted half an inch. The pause stretched. And then, in a voice clear enough to cut through a century of ceremony, she began, "Your Honor, I have one more question. One that deserves a real answer, not laughter. You could hear it, the collective inhale. It wasn't defiance for defiance's sake. It was precision. It was a fuse finding the charge." Kavanaugh's smirk didn't vanish. It adjusted, the way a veteran adjusts to a rookie's unexpected footwork. He lounged in that narrow space between confidence and dismissal, convinced the courtroom's gravity would always bend back to him. He had reason to believe it. The bench is built on tradition, and tradition often mistakes certainty for wisdom. But tradition can only buy time. It can't buy immunity. Not from facts. Not from lived experience. And not from a question designed like a key. We're going to the moment that set off a chain reaction. 30 seconds that jumped from wood-paneled walls to every screen in America. We'll dissect the line that detonated in the silence and why it mattered far beyond this room. But to feel the voltage, you have to stand right here, in this exact breath, before the match meets the edge. That's where Crockett is now, not striking a pose, striking a point. She doesn't raise her voice. She narrows it. She doesn't chase attention. She controls it. And in the kind of stillness that usually protects power, she makes stillness serve her. Remember the setup. Hours of questions had evaporated into curated answers. Jokes had been made at the expense of patience. A civics lesson had been suggested to a sitting member of Congress like a pat on the head with a legal citation. It played well to those who enjoy the performance of certainty. But performances end. Records remain. And Crockett hadn't come to spar. She'd come to put the record under light. Here's your hook. What she says in under a minute doesn't just quiet a smirk, it recalibrates the bench. It forces a reckoning between law as theory and law as weather, the kind of weather you stand in for 2 hours on asphalt, because your precinct runs on delays and your life runs on wages. It takes a phrase that's safe inside law review and drags it into the line outside a polling place. If you're thinking this is about political theater, you're only half right. Theater needs an audience. Accountability needs evidence. Crockett brought evidence. Watch the posture. She places the folder like a metronome, a subtle tempo that tells the room she's counting beats. She's measured her distance to the microphone, to the bench, to the red light on the camera. She's measured most of all the distance between a right on paper and a right in practice. Kavanaugh leans back. She leans in. He smirks. She steadies. He treats time like he owns it. She treats time like it matters. The visual alone tells a story the transcript can't. 2 versions of authority occupying the same square of American architecture, about to collide. We're not here to recount a shouting match. There wasn't one. This is a masterclass in weight, what words weigh when they're chosen, what silence weighs when it's imposed, what history weighs when it enters a room without knocking. Crockett's opening line is a scalpel, not a hammer. It invites an answer and simultaneously narrows the permissible exits. That's the brilliance. A question that sounds simple but is built like a maze with only one honest path through. If you've ever wondered why some moments go viral while others vanish, memorize this blueprint. Stakes you can feel. Characters drawn by their choices, not by someone else's narration. a setting that magnifies consequence. And a turn, one turn, that reveals who was prepared and who was merely present. This is that turn. The justices shift slightly. The chief watches the temperature. Counsel at their tables trade looks that say, this could get messy or historic, maybe both. In the gallery, you can track certainty like a stock ticker, rising on one side, plummeting on the other, because certainty is the first casualty of a good question. And what's coming is the question inside the question. Not what does the Constitution mean, but who pays the price while you decide. Feel how the floor lengthens between podium and bench? That's not architecture, that's context. The bench lives at altitude. Footnotes, precedent, doctrines refined by decades of distance. The podium lives at street level. Buses, childcare, paychecks that shrink by the hour. Crockett is the adapter in that outlet. She's here to plug lived voltage into institutional wiring and see what trips. And there's the second hook. You think this is about a single justice and a single representative. It isn't. It's about whether the word fundamental can survive contact with a stopwatch. It's about whether a 2-hour wait becomes an inconvenience in language because language enjoys the luxury of chairs. It's about whether laughter in a marble room can drown out testimony in a folding chair outside a gymnasium on election day. Spoiler, it can't. Not today. Kavanaugh's smile thins the way, smiles. Thin when the room stops being a room and starts being a record. Behind every camera lens is a timeline. Behind every transcript is a replay button. Behind every replay is a memory that refuses to be patronized. He can feel it, even if he won't admit it, the subtle rearrangement of power when questions carry receipts. He can argue doctrine. He can fence with hypotheticals. He cannot laugh off a ledger. Crockett's eyes don't leave the bench. No theatrics, no flourish, no digressions about destiny or doom. Just the quiet escalation of someone who knows exactly where the hinge is and exactly how much torque it needs. She isn't chasing a quote. She's building a doorway. When she steps through it, the room will follow, willingly or not. This is the promise of the next few minutes of your time. We'll show you the hinge and the torque. We'll strip the exchange down to the mechanism that made it inevitable. We'll explain why a single line, delivered without a raised voice, can flip a national narrative and make an institution blink. And we'll do it without melodrama because the facts don't need it. They only need space, so stay with this breath. Hold the silence with us. The bench is waiting for the question it thinks it's heard 1,000 times. The gallery is waiting for a soundbite. The cameras are waiting for a stumble. But the moment is waiting for something else, a point of no return. Crockett is already there. The last laugh has already happened. The next sentence will make sure it doesn't happen again. Your Honor, she says, as if the word itself should carry a mirror. I have one more question. And the room, at last, understands what it means to be ready. Crockett didn't tour the victory like a float. She recentered the conversation in every interview, redirecting hosts who wanted drama toward data and asking, on air, the same procedural question. What evidence would persuade you? It's a deceptively humble line that doubles as an accusation. If you can't answer, maybe you're not persuadable. Maybe you're protecting an outcome and calling it process. That's not a soundbite. That's a standard. Kavanaugh, for his part, did not mount a public defense. Supreme Court justices rarely do, and this one wasn't going to start. But observers of the court's choreography noticed something intangible in the next sitting. Fewer quips, more deference to full questions, a judicial tone that was less convinced that impatience and rigor are synonyms. It wasn't contrition. It was the small, institutional acknowledgement that attention had made the walls thinner. Here's the cannier shift, the one that outlasts the clip. The argument map changed. Plaintiffs began filing briefs with clearer metrics, daring courts to accept or reject them explicitly. If 2 hours is not undue, is 3. Turned into exhibits that plotted burden curves against precinct demographics. Defendants learned to show their math, not just their maxims, resource spreadsheets, allocation models, contingency plans, because after that day, saying integrity without proof read like superstition. Judicial opinions, even in other jurisdictions, began sneaking in a sentence or two, acknowledging wait times as legally relevant facts. Law is slow, but it does take notes. Meanwhile, out where people live and not only argue, a phrase migrated into daily use, "Democracy Costs," printed on cardboard signs and T-shirts and the backs of notebooks. It wasn't fatalism. It was a refusal to let the price be hidden. If you say cost out loud often enough, budgets change. If you pretend the cost is zero, only those with surplus can afford to pay. By week's end, the clip had become a kind of shared checkpoint. Politicians were asked whether they agreed with the sentence. Candidates were pressed to specify their threshold. Election officials were invited, sometimes ambushed, to walk journalists through their ratios. It wasn't a purity test. It was a literacy test for power. Can you talk about this without hiding behind abstractions? Can you show us your ruler? That is the shockwave you measure, not in likes or retweets, but in how many people stop accepting neutral as a synonym for fair. Once you've seen a wait time chart drawn over a map you know too well, you don't forget where the colors darken. Once you've watched a bench blink when asked for a number, you learn to ask for numbers from everyone who claims to govern you. And the smirk? It didn't become a villain's mask. It became a cautionary tale about how tone curdles into evidence when the record is ready, about how laughter performs authority until it meets a question that asks authority to measure itself. In the aftermath, nobody burned the institution down. The building was still there, columns steady, flags in their assigned breeze. But something inside had shifted a half degree toward the people who stand outside in lines that bend around corners and into afternoons. The clip didn't create that shift. It revealed it, then accelerated it. Fallout isn't always debris. Sometimes it's clarity that finally sticks to the surfaces it's been bouncing off for years. That's what the country held in its hands that week. A piece of clarity, portable and precise. Not a cudgel, a measuring tape. And once you hand people a ruler, it's only a matter of time before they start using it. A year is a long time for headlines, and a short time for habits. Long enough for the clip to fall out of trending bars, short enough that its echo still fits inside meetings where policy is drawn with pencils and erasers instead of speeches. The moment in that chamber did not become a relic. It became a reference, pulled up in PowerPoints, embedded in trainings, quoted in rooms that prefer footnotes to feelings. Not as a talisman, but as a template. Evidence first, boundaries next. Humility demanded last. Start where institutions breathe, courts. Opinions did not suddenly start quoting poetry. They did something quieter and more consequential. They started counting. Not everywhere, not always, but enough times to mark a shift. You could find sentences acknowledging wait time data as a fact, not as flavor text. Judges who once waved at administrability without peeking under the hood began to ask for logs, machine allocations, staffing ratios, cure notices sent and received. Even dissents sharpened. If a court refused to weigh cost, the dissent would specify the cost, line by line, and dare the majority to call arithmetic narrative. The law stayed slow, because law is slow, but its gait bent toward measurement. In election offices where fluorescent lights hum over whiteboards, the legacy wore a more practical face. Administrators adjusted not because they were converted, but because they were cornered by clarity. A few counties adopted machine-to-voter floors calibrated to turnout patterns. Some extended early voting in precincts tethered to bus schedules rather than car culture. Cure periods for mail-in signatures nudged from hours to days, with notices sent by text and phone instead of disappearing into mailboxes that don't always catch up. None of these changes transformed the map. They did, however, redraw the edge cases into fewer cases and less edge. That is how systems improve, not in fanfare, but in fewer excuses. In classrooms, the country likes to forget until September. The clip turned into a case study. Civics teachers asked students to define undue burden and defend their thresholds with real numbers. Buses every 30 minutes, daycare at 6, wage penalties in quarter-hour increments. Government instructors walked through the doctrine and then made teenagers do what the bench had dodged. Choose a threshold and own it. Debate teams practiced the turn Crockett used, refusing to trade empathy for evidence, insisting on both, and discovered that most gotcha moments wilt when confronted with a clear request. Tell me what evidence would persuade you. The pedagogy wasn't new. The example was, in law schools, the moment acquired its own lecture. Professors who don't usually praise politicians parsed the method. Not a soundbite laid over emptiness, but scaffolding built to carry a final line. Clinics that teach impact litigation added modules on operational, proof, how to collect the kind of logs, and rosters that transform "it's unfair" into "here is the failure." Point. Moot courts borrowed the hinge question, specify the metric and the threshold, and discovered that even the most confident mock justices looked smaller when they declined to answer. It wasn't humiliation. It was a rehearsal for accountability. Politics measured legacy differently, by the way language migrated. Democracy costs left a caption and entered speech, not as resignation, but as a prompt. If it costs, someone should pay, and the bill shouldn't always land on the same tables. Candidates learned to talk about access with ratios, not just reverence. Journalists, now armed with a public appetite for numbers, stopped accepting integrity unaccompanied by math. In town halls that smell like coffee and floor polish, voters asked not if officials supported the right to vote, but what their machine allocations would be on election day. The question changed from values to variables, and variables are harder to dodge. As for the people at the center of the clip, their trajectories did not become fairy tales or tragedies. They became adjustments. Kavanaugh's questions in subsequent sittings shortened a shade, his tone leaning more on inquiry than instruction. He didn't apologize, because justices don't. He didn't grandstand, because the room had learned to notice. He recalibrated the way professionals do, when reminded that skill and posture are different instruments. The smirk did not become myth. It became a memo to self. Confidence without criteria is camouflage. Crockett did not turn into a comet, bright, brief, forgotten. She showed up again and again with the same method. Ask for the metric, ask for the threshold, bring the receipts. In committee rooms where grandstanding is the native dialect, she stayed bilingual, translating lived time into line items and letting numbers embarrass evasions. Interviews tried to drag her back to the meme. She steered them to the math. When hosts asked if she felt vindicated, she answered with a list of counties that had changed their staffing ratios. Vindication is content. Outcomes are legacy. But the more profound afterlife belongs to places where neither of them stood. In neighborhoods where lines used to carve afternoons into regret, small differences accumulated. A few more machines, a few more volunteers, a few fewer abandonments when the babysitter's clock ran out. In union halls where schedules pinch like shoes, extended early voting hours cut into the stress that turns civic duty into triage. In senior centers where legs set the schedule, chairs appeared along serpentine lines, not a solution, but an admission that comfort is not a luxury in a republic that expects participation. There were backlashes, of course, because attention irritates power the way dust irritates eyes. Editorialists scolded about respect. Think pieces warned of erosion of norms, as if norms were neutral habitats and not often the guardrails of convenience. Some tried to reframe the moment as a win for partisanship. The tape still fixed that. Calm tone, precise facts, a demand for criteria. When you watch it again, the partisanship reads less like heat than like care. Care for the cost, care for the count, care for the distance between a word on a page and a life in a line. If you're looking for the single clean lesson, you'll be disappointed. The moment did not prove that one side loves democracy and the other does not, or that one judge is indifferent and another is pure. It proved something less cinematic and more useful. When institutions are asked to specify their standards, they either become clearer or smaller. Clarity is painful because it commits you. Smallness is costly because it concedes that your power survives best in vagueness. The bench blinked. The country noticed. That is enough to move furniture. There is also this. People learned a question they can carry into rooms that don't broadcast. City council meeting? What evidence would persuade you that this route change harms commuters? School board. What metric will you use to decide whether this policy works? Hospital advisory panel? What threshold triggers a staffing change? The strategy isn't a trick. It's a courtesy wrapped around a demand. It assumes sincerity and then tests for it. If the answer is anything but an answer, you've learned what you need to know without a headline. Legacy has a quieter register too, the personal one. Ask the volunteers who kept showing up to staff the line, the ones who bring clipboards and folding stools and granola bars to precincts that need patience more than pep talks. They'll tell you that the clip didn't create their work. It made it feel less like charity and more like infrastructure. Ask the seniors who carry lawn chairs now without apology. They'll tell you that being seen changed nothing about their legs and everything about their dignity. Ask the kid who watched the exchange in a government class and decided that numbers are not the enemy of justice. They're the tools of it. He'll tell you that law school isn't the only path to advocacy, but it's on the map now. What endured most was a recalibrated definition of respect. Respect did not mean silence in the face of altitude. It meant accuracy in the face of evasions. It meant asking hard questions without heat, and refusing to accept we don't measure that as a synonym for it doesn't matter. It meant treating institutions as capable of better, not as incapable of fault. That kind of respect can feel like insult to those who confuse deference with dignity. To everyone else, it feels like citizenship finally remembering its job description. The building is still there, of course. Columns, coffered ceilings, the eagle perched above the bench. But if you stand on those steps and listen, really listen, you can hear the country using a new word more often: threshold. What's the threshold for a right to be real? What's the threshold for a policy to count as success? What's the threshold for patience to stop being civic virtue and start being coerced compliance? These aren't slogans. They're rulers. And rulers, once handed out, don't get returned. The last frame is not a prophecy. It's a practice. The next time a powerful room laughs at a question, the laugh will not echo as cleanly. Somewhere in the back, someone will wait through the chuckle and then say, specify the metric. Specify the threshold. Somewhere at the front, someone will realize the old exits are smaller than they remember. And somewhere in the middle, where most of us sit, the line will move a little faster, because it is harder now to pretend that time is free. That's the legacy, not a hero, not a villain. A ruler passed from a microphone to a country that had been guessing. And once you stop guessing, once you know the cost, you can start sending the bill where it belongs. The camera shifts, but the narration doesn't soften. To understand why that microphone mattered, why one congresswoman's words could shake marble and memory, you need to know who she was. Before the lights hit her face, Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in Washington polished by legacy. She wasn't carried into office on family nameplates or gilded networks. She came from the streets of Dallas, where working class meant every dollar counted and every choice had consequences. Her childhood wasn't a campaign story. It was a crash course in resilience. Parents who knew hard work but not privilege. Schools where textbooks were old and expectations were low. A community that taught her that survival is a kind of education too. While others studied in quiet dorm rooms, Crockett worked double shifts and chased law books by fluorescent light. She fought her way through law school not as an heir apparent, but as a first-generation fighter. Tuition didn't vanish because she wished it away. It came from jobs that demanded her time, her energy, her sleep. Nights blurred into mornings, and mornings into more hours at the desk. She didn't just read constitutional law, she lived its gaps, felt its absences in her rent checks and in the stories of neighbors who couldn't afford to miss work just to stand in a voting line. That's the foundation, lived contradiction. Learning how the Constitution was supposed to work while watching how often it didn't. Studying equal protection while watching classmates balance opportunity like a second inheritance. Reading about the Voting Rights Act while knowing firsthand who bore the longest waits, the toughest IDs, the hardest climbs. For Crockett, legal theory wasn't abstract. It was personal. It was urgent. When she became a public defender, that urgency sharpened. Courtrooms weren't marble halls then. They were crowded dockets, weary judges, and clients who couldn't afford mistakes. She represented people who didn't have money for bail, people whose names were statistics long before they were arguments. She fought to give voice to those the system had trained itself not to hear. That work branded her, not as a savior, but as someone unwilling to let the silenced stay silent, and that in Washington makes you stand out. At 33, Crockett wasn't supposed to be a heavyweight. She was young, a newcomer in a city that values seniority as currency. But youth isn't weakness when it's welded to preparation. Colleagues learned quickly. Crockett didn't just show up. She showed up with the receipts. She asked the questions others avoided. She read the footnotes. She pressed until the polish cracked and the truth bled through. That earned her allies and enemies. Fearless, some said with admiration. Fearless, others said as a warning. But fearless is not the same as reckless. Crockett didn't grandstand for applause. She built her case like she built her career, line by line, detail by detail, weight by weight. When she spoke in committee rooms, people noticed. Not because she shouted, but because she dissected. Not because she demanded respect, but because she earned it through precision. That's the woman who stepped to the microphone that day. Not just a politician. Not just a lawyer, but a bridge between lived reality and legislative power. She carried the contradictions of her community into chambers that often pretended those contradictions didn't exist. She knew what it was to work 2 jobs just to keep tuition checks from bouncing. She knew what it was to represent clients who had to choose between pleading guilty or missing work. She knew what it was to stand in line for hours because access to the ballot was rationed like privilege. And when she spoke about those things, she didn't need to rehearse empathy. She needed only to remember that memory is her sharpest weapon. It disarms pretense. It forces theory into contact with reality. When she cites a 2-hour wait at a polling place, she isn't imagining it. She's lived adjacent to it. When she talks about barriers, she isn't performing outrage. She's recalling names, faces, and court files. This is why her confrontation mattered. Without her story, it's just another clash of ideology. With her story, it's a collision between 2 Americas. One that lives the law and one that interprets it from altitude. One that counts every hour in line, and one that counts doctrine in volumes. So when you see her in that chamber, folder in hand, don't mistake composure for privilege. It's forged from repetition, from years of having to prove competence to rooms that didn't expect it. It's the poise of someone who has been told to wait her turn and chose instead to prepare so thoroughly that no turn could be denied. Here's the hook. Crockett wasn't just another lawmaker asking questions. She was a representative of every voter who had been told, in words or in laughter, that their struggle was political narrative. She carried their stories like exhibits into a courtroom that preferred abstractions. And when she asked her question, she wasn't simply speaking to Kavanaugh. She was speaking to history, demanding it stop skipping footnotes written in lived experience. This part of the story is essential. Because without knowing where Crockett came from, without understanding the climb, the grind, the insistence, you can't measure the weight of what happened when she made a justice falter. Her question didn't come out of nowhere. It came from every long night of study, every dismissed client, every hour spent waiting for a right that should have been instant. The truth is this: power isn't just about who sits on the bench. It's about who dares to ask the question anyway. Crockett dared, because she had been preparing long before the cameras arrived. And that's the backstory. That's the challenger. That's why, when she said, "I have one more question," the room froze. It wasn't just her speaking. It was the echo of everyone who had been laughed at, silenced, or dismissed. And that echo was about to shake the chamber. He did not arrive at that bench by accident. Brett Kavanaugh is what institutions look like when they learn how to replicate themselves. Credentials layered on credentials. Clerkships stitched to commissions. Networks tied so tightly they start to feel like gravity. Yale College. Yale Law. Prestigious clerkships, including one at the Supreme Court. Counsel in the White House. Years on the D.C. Circuit. The pipeline where appellate rigor is refined into Supreme Court readiness. His resume isn't a ladder. It's a locked staircase. The kind built so the next step is always waiting when the previous one is complete. He is fluent in the language of precedent, fluent enough to rearrange its furniture without appearing to move the walls. He believes in doctrine measured by tests, factors, frameworks, scales that claim neutrality because they are calibrated in books instead of neighborhoods. If you want to understand his confidence, understand this. For most of his career, rooms listened when he spoke. Not because he shouted, but because the rooms were designed to find him credible before he opened his mouth. That design hardens over decades. It can feel like certainty. Kavanaugh's public story arcs through Washington at altitude, special counsel work in the 1990s, a senior role in the early 2000s, then a long stretch as a federal judge during which his opinions read like precise architecture. Clean lines, decisive holdings, trimmed edges. He is comfortable with the grammar of power, standing, jurisdiction, justiciability, long gates that decide who gets to bring their injuries inside. He is most at home where arguments are measured in citations and time is measured in pages. And then there is the part of his story no one forgets, the confirmation storm. The hearings that cracked the facade of inevitability and put raw emotion on full display. The nation watched as accusation, denial, partisanship, and pain collided in a chamber that pretends it is immune to human temperature. He survived it narrowly, painfully, visibly. Survival in that context becomes a kind of armor. Once forged, it can make a person more careful. It can also make them more certain. Either way, it marks them. As a justice, Kavanaugh's style settled into what admirers call pragmatic conservatism. Attentive to text, wary of sweeping leaps, inclined toward rules he can articulate and repeat. He likes lines, bright ones if he can draw them, multi-factor ones if he must. He talks about neutrality not as posture, but as discipline, a promise to place his own preferences behind the scrim of law. The bench rewards that pitch. A steady hand reads well in transcripts. But there is another register that the transcript rarely captures: impatience. Not just the impatience of calendars and heavy dockets, but the impatience of someone who thinks he has seen the shape of an argument before the sentence is finished. He interrupts when he believes time is being wasted. He trims questions that wander. He can sound like a man ensuring efficiency in a complicated process. He can also sound like a man convinced that expertise should not be inconvenienced by persistence. That edge, respectful on paper, sharp in the room, has precedent of its own. He's not the only justice who treats oral argument as a stress test for counsel, but in hearings that bleed beyond chambers, where elected officials ask questions and the public listens, that edge risks reading as something else: dismissal. In a city trained to hear what tone implies, tone becomes content. To Kavanaugh's supporters, the criticism is unfair. They see a jurist balancing principle with practicality, unwilling to let anecdotes harden into constitutional commands. They hear a judge refusing to turn empathy into doctrine, holding the line between heartfelt stories and enforceable rules. They praise his insistence that correlation is not causation, that courts measure evidence, not emotion, and that hard cases should not become instruments for bad law. That steadiness, they argue, keeps the court from becoming a super-legislature bent by every gust of public feeling. To his critics, the steadiness can read like insulation. The frameworks can feel like distance. A 2-hour line is not a factor. It is an afternoon in the sun while wages shrink. A modest burden is not an abstraction. It is a missed bus and a missed shift. When the law's vocabulary turns concrete hardship into airy categories, some hear not neutrality but neglect. And when the voice delivering that vocabulary carries the residue of old networks and older privileges, the room can tighten. Both readings matter, because both traveled into the chamber the day Jasmine Crockett stepped to the microphone. Kavanaugh brought more than a smirk. He brought a world view trained in appellate repetition. We do not decide politics, we decide law. He brought a belief that courts cannot, must not, become referees for every story that breaks hearts. And he brought a reflex that has served him for decades: sort, narrow, decide. In that reflex, laughter can feel like economy, a way to press past what he thinks is noise and anchor the room to what he thinks is signal. But there's a blind spot embedded in that reflex. Signal and noise look different at street level. What reads as outlier in an appendix reads as Tuesday afternoon in certain zip codes. What passes as not undue inside a framework registers as defeat when daycare closes at 6. The more a judge's universe revolves around briefs, clerks, and a docket curated by certiorari, the easier it becomes to treat people as examples and systems as the only actors worth measuring. It is not malice. It is gravity. The gravity of institutions that reward abstraction and depreciate proximity. Kavanaugh's life trained him to trust that gravity. Elite schools teach fluency in argument. Prestigious posts teach comfort with consequence. The D.C. Circuit teaches the confidence to write rules other courts will follow. These are strengths, genuine, earned, important. They are also habits. Habits are efficient until the moment they are not. In a courtroom where elected representatives speak not just for themselves but for districts, those habits collide with constituencies that do not answer to the federal reporter. This is why he leaned back that day, why the smile looked automatic, why the first laugh arrived as if on schedule. In his experience, confidence dissuades digression. A justice's time is scarce. A justice's tone conserves it. He has been in countless rooms where that calculus works. He had not been in many rooms with Jasmine Crockett at the microphone, and the country listening for a line that did not sound like condescension disguised as discipline. Understand the stakes for him. Concede too much to narrative and you risk turning doctrine into daytime television. Concede too little and you risk looking like the law's custodian of indifference. He would rather take the first risk, because the court's authority depends on distance. He knows the court is not designed to be a town hall. He fears what happens when it pretends otherwise. But authority that never descends forgets how the stairs feel. Crockett was there to make the stairs felt. If Kavanaugh is the establishment incarnate, it is not because he is uniquely arrogant. It is because his path and his practice represent the dominant American template for legal power. Elite training, elite mentorship, elite elevation, then a promise of neutrality policed by self-awareness and tradition. The template works until it meets a question that refuses to stay within its lines. Then, the template must either adapt or harden. On that day, in that chamber, you saw a man who had spent decades mastering the architecture of neutrality, confronted by a voice trained to test the load-bearing capacity of that architecture. Here is the hook that matters going forward. Kavanaugh doesn't lose because he is unprepared. He falters because his preparation assumed that the strongest challenge would be doctrinal. It wasn't. It was moral weight strapped to legal precision, an argument that resisted the false choice between story and standard. For a moment, a rare televised moment, the establishment faced not a speech but a cross-examination of its own distance. That is who Brett Kavanaugh is in this story. Not a villain painted in caricature, but a craftsman of frameworks, certain that discipline protects the law's legitimacy. Certain enough to laugh when he hears what he believes is performance. Certain until a question arrives that treats 2 hours in line as a constitutional fact, not a rhetorical flourish. Certain until certainty finally is forced to listen. Strip away the marble and the microphones and what remains is a question that fits in a single breath. How long should democracy make you wait? That's the live wire under the wood of this hearing, the case from Texas that turns theory into asphalt, ballot access into a stopwatch, and fundamental right into the length of a shadow that crawls across a parking lot while you stand in line. Texas didn't arrive here by accident either. The state's election code is a maze where each turn looks small. An ID rule here, a mail-in limit there, a signature match, a drop box count, a deadline shaved from days to hours. No single wall admits it is a wall, but together they form a corridor that narrows most for those who carry the least. Hourly workers, the elderly, the disabled, students far from home, voters in precincts where resources are rationed and patience is treated like a luxury good. The lawsuit at the heart of this hearing threads those pieces into a single claim, that burden isn't incidental, it's structural. And the Constitution should notice, on paper, the questions sound tidy. Do the new mail-in restrictions impose more than a modest burden? Are long waits the product of neutral administration or selective neglect? Does the state's interest in preventing fraud justify tighter gates even when fraud is rare enough to hide in decimals? Those are the lines the briefs print in crisp fonts. But paper does not sweat. Paper does not pick up a child at 6 or lose a shift at 3. Paper has never watched a line barely move while the sun moves 7 inches. Here's the shape of the dispute. Texas argues that voting is a serious civic act and serious acts require procedures. The state says convenience is not a constitutional right, and uniform rules cannot be unconstitutional merely because they are inconvenient for some. It points to resource limits, chain of custody concerns, and the need to maintain confidence in results. It calls the new rules guardrails. It calls the wait times unfortunate, but not unlawful. It trusts that neutral text produces neutral outcomes. The plaintiffs answer with geography and clocks. They map precincts where the average wait crosses 2 hours and compare them to precincts that breeze through in 12 minutes. They pile affidavits from nurses getting off double shifts, from seniors whose legs swell after 30 minutes, from parents who budget time like money and watch both run out. They show a patchwork of polling place closures and relocations, of machine shortages and staffing gaps, of mail-in rejections that spike after rule changes. They don't ask the court to guarantee comfort. They ask it to recognize when inconvenience is code for exclusion, and when neutral rules become a net that catches the same bodies over and over. Again, that's the case Crockett walked into, a courtroom where two languages were about to collide. One language speaks in standards and tiers of scrutiny. It likes scales, tests, and principled lines that can survive 1,000 citations. The other language speaks in bus schedules and aching backs, in daycare cutoffs and the price of missing a punch-in. It likes receipts. It insists that if a right is fundamental, the path to exercise it cannot be paved with exceptions only the comfortable can tolerate. Watch how the framing battles for home field. The state wants the question to be, can the legislature adopt uniform, facially neutral rules to protect election integrity? The challengers want the question to be, when do uniform rules become discriminatory in operation and unconstitutional in effect? The state wants the court to weigh interests in the abstract. The challengers want the court to weigh bodies in the line. This is also a fight about what counts as evidence. The state treats stories as sympathetic but unstable, too variable to anchor constitutional doctrine. It prefers numbers: fraud incidents prevented, ballots processed, dollars budgeted. The challengers bring numbers too, but they insist the numbers live inside stories. A 2-hour median doesn't register until you ask whose median it is and what 2 hours cost them. Without that, modest burden becomes an academic shrug. Here is your hinge. The Constitution promises a right that is fundamental, and courts have long said fundamental rights deserve more than casual respect. But the machinery that delivers those rights lives in counties, budgets, and parking lots. The court must decide whether that machinery can routinely produce two realities and still satisfy one constitution. If equality is a promise, is patience a price each citizen pays equally, or a levy that falls heaviest where power already weighs? Listen for the escape routes. One route says, the court should not second-guess administrative trade-offs. Write a narrow opinion and move on. Another route says, the burden here is proven, but the fix belongs to legislatures. Remand with a nudge and wash your hands. A third route, the hardest and rarest, says, when patterns are this consistent, neutrality is not a defense. The state must redesign the system so the right does not depend on the neighborhood you live in or the cushion in your life. Now, bring the camera back to the chamber. Why does this case carry more voltage than most? Because the stakes do not end with ballots. They start there. Elections allocate schooling, housing, healthcare, safety, and courts. If access to voting is stratified, every downstream policy inherits that skew. A 2-hour line does not only tax a day, it taxes a city's future. Everyone in the room knows it, even those who would rather not say it out loud. This is where Crockett's presence changes the chemical balance. She is not an amicus with statistics and a polite bow. She is an elected official from the terrain the data describes. She arrives not to embellish but to translate. When she asks about wait times, she is not asking the court to feel. She is asking it to recognize. When she asks about mail-in rules, she is not seeking leniency. She is demanding rationality that includes the lives of those who can least afford elective difficulty, and the bench accustomed to attorneys who treat justices like distant arbiters meets a representative who treats them like decision-makers, accountable to a democracy that notices the difference between 12 minutes and 2 hours. That's not a tone problem. That's a jurisdictional fact. The people who stand in those lines built this building too. A word about integrity, the state's favored talisman. Integrity without access is performance. Integrity is not a charm you hang on a locked door. It is the outcome of systems that invite participation and produce results people can verify and trust. The plaintiffs aren't asking to lower the bar for confidence. They are asking to remove tripwires that confidence does not need. Fraud prevention does not require making grandmothers choose between pain and participation. Chain of custody safeguards do not require turning signatures into gotchas for trembling hands. So the question returns, simpler and harder. When the state makes voting available in form but punishing in practice, what level of punishment turns availability into theater? Where is the constitutional line between friction that protects and friction that excludes? And who gets to draw that line? The administrators who design the maze, or the court when it sees the same bodies hitting the same walls? That is the case at stake distilled. Not a culture war, not a cable segment, an engineering problem with constitutional consequences. You can build an election system that is safe and generous. You can build one that is safe and stingy. Texas chose the latter. The lawsuit asks whether the Constitution tolerates that choice when stinginess lands, predictably on the same backs. Hold that frame. As we move back into the room where tone becomes headline and headline becomes pressure. Because when a justice laughs at a question about the cost of voting, he is not just laughing at a politician. He is laughing at the engineering problem while the bridge is still shaking. And the person at the microphone has brought schematics. The next beat is not about manners. It is about measurements. Crockett is about to force the chamber to pick a ruler. Doctrine insulated from impact, or doctrine calibrated to the lives it governs. She knows which ruler she's brought. The question is whether the bench will pretend not to see it, or whether, for once, it will measure what the Constitution says it protects. Morning sessions have a rhythm. Counsel at the lectern, questions from the bench, a glide of formality that lulls even sharp minds into routine. That rhythm carried the room until it didn't. The docket moved, the clock agreed, and the justices probed the familiar seams of standing and burdens and administrability. But beneath the marble calm, you could feel a second tempo building, quicker, tighter, pushed forward by interruptions that began as nudges and matured into cuts. Kavanaugh set the metronome. Not rudely, not at first. Just a practiced interjection here, a trimming of preambles there, the kind of let's focus that sounds efficient when you've never had your time trimmed by someone else. He has a gift for framing, for snapping the debate to the axis he prefers. Counsel isn't the real question. But your rule would require, point me to the case that says, each line a narrowing, each narrowing a claim of the high ground. Most advocates adapt. They tidy their answers to fit the grooves he lays down. They mistake compliance for momentum. Then came the representative's turn, rare, but permitted in the format of this hearing, and the room discovered that elected voices don't always fit judicial grooves. A few Democrats tried to widen the aperture, to tug doctrine toward lived consequence. Kavanaugh's responses told a different story. He called for discipline in the hypotheticals. He favored general principles over concrete failures. He wore patience the way a firefighter wears a coat, useful when the heat rises, cumbersome when it doesn't. At first, the tone read as managerial. But tone, like gravity, accumulates. The interruptions sharpened. When Congressman Jamie Raskin sketched a chain of cause and effect, from mail-in rejection spikes to precinct closures to 2-hour lines, Kavanaugh lifted a hand. Counselor, correlation is not causation. Let's not turn anecdotes into constitutional commands. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped into algorithmic purges of voter rolls, he pivoted. We are not a legislature. We do not design systems. We review them. Precision, yes. Also, dismissal, edged with the confidence of someone who trusts the room, will endorse his edits. By the time Jasmine Crockett approached the microphone in the late morning, the air held a residue, microscopic particles of belittlement that most people pretend not to breathe. She didn't flinch. She led with precedent, the blandest route to common ground. Justice Kavanaugh, in your confirmation you called voting fundamental. Do you still hold that view? Of course, he said, signaling that we were back in safe territory, the land of statements no one disputes. She tightened. Would you agree that barriers to that right deserve strict scrutiny? A nod, a caveat. The choreography was familiar, and he assumed he could conduct it. She moved to specifics. In Williams versus Texas, a case whose name alone narrowed the room's focus, you wrote that a 2-hour wait is not an undue burden. Did the racial distribution of those waits enter your analysis? The question was a trap only if the answer was careless. He chose confidence. Congresswoman, you are oversimplifying a complex decision. The word oversimplifying landed with more weight than it carried. It tends to when deployed downward. Crockett did not blink. I'm quoting your opinion in the record. Predominantly white precincts averaged 12 minutes. Predominantly black and Latino precincts averaged over 2 hours. Did those facts matter? A good question changes the room's oxygen. This one did. The gallery leaned in. The justices stilled. Kavanaugh adjusted papers that did not need adjusting. Correlation, he repeated, is not causation. We cannot turn narratives into doctrine. It sounded like a seminar reminder. It sounded like a door closing. Here is where the morning's rhythm broke. Crockett didn't counter with outrage. She countered with calibration. We are not discussing narratives. We are discussing distributions. We are discussing a right labeled fundamental and a burden unequally borne. If the court declines to weigh that burden because it is messy, what good is the label? She didn't say it loudly. She said it like a fact returning to its owner. The room felt it. He felt it. He could have taken the off-ramp, acknowledged the facts, distinguished the doctrine, invite a better record. He chose posture. "Congresswoman," he said, and the swerve into condescension was small but visible. "With all due respect, I have been practicing constitutional law since before you were out of high school. I think I understand these issues quite well." Then it happened, the short, sharp laugh. Not loud, not long, but the kind of laugh that files an entire person's argument under adorable. Gasps are rarely audible in marble, but you could hear this one. Not because a justice cannot laugh, humans leak sound, but because of what it declared: seniority over scrutiny, tenure over testimony, altitude over street. The moment crystallized the subtext of the morning into text. It was a courthouse version of the oldest move in power. Translate a question you don't like into a lesson someone else supposedly needs. The civics class line fell a minute later. You might be better served by a civics class. And it landed like chalk dust on a black suit. Old school, clinging, visible. It was meant as a brush-off. It read like a dare. Did he mean harm? Probably not, in the conscious sense. People steeped in institutional time often mistake correction for clarity. They believe that narrowing a conversation is a service. They forget that narrowing can also erase. They forget that telling a representative of 700,000 people to take a class feels like a small disenfranchisement all its own. Crockett didn't lunge. She let the insult hang, absorbing its shape and temperature like a black box recording turbulence. She thanked the bench. She closed her folder. She yielded. It looked like retreat to anyone measuring the morning minute by minute. It was not retreat. It was reconnaissance. She had learned what she needed to learn. The frame he would defend, the tone he would risk, the gap he could not see between a doctrinal diagram and a line that eats a worker's entire afternoon. The gallery whispered during the recess. Reporters wrote it down as tone, a tense exchange, a brisk correction, a flash of frustration. But tone was only the surface. The substance was more telling. A justice publicly downgrading the value of empirical disparities to the status of political narrative. A justice warning against feeling when the facts themselves had weight. This is the move that traditional power makes when confronted by modern evidence. It pretends measurement is melodrama. Staffers outside traded versions of the moment the way people trade weather reports. Did you hear the laugh? He told her to take a civics class. She didn't flinch. Inside, on the bench, you could sense a consciousness of optics settling in like a late shadow. The chief's glances stretched a beat longer. A colleague's pen tapped a little faster. But the machine moved on. Cases do not stop for bruised air. What mattered was not that Crockett had been dismissed. What mattered was what she would do with the dismissal. In politics, humiliation often becomes spectacle. In advocacy, it can become architecture. Crockett chose architecture. She spent the break not gathering applause lines, but collecting citations. Not polishing a clapback, but sharpening a question whose answer could not hide inside tone. Here's the hinge the morning gave us. Kavanaugh had shown his likely instinctive refuge, the doctrinal cave where weighing real-world disparities can be recast as indulging narratives. He had also shown a willingness to signal status when pressed. That combination is combustible when exposed to the oxygen of a prepared opponent. The last 5 minutes before lunch looked ordinary. The bench asked about administrability and limiting principles. Lawyers nodded. The clock slid, but the room's center of gravity had shifted by inches, and inches matter when everything is balanced on decorum. Crockett sat with her folder closed and her jaw set, not in anger, but in alignment. She had the geometry now, where to press, where the wall was thinnest, where the smile would crack if the weight was honest enough. A final note on the civics line. It tried to reassign roles, teacher and student, expert and novice, bench and gallery. But civics, properly understood, isn't deference to altitude. It's literacy and accountability. The lesson the morning gave was simple. When the law forgets the people it governs, civics invites the people back into the sentence. Crockett would return to teach that class, with exhibits. When the gavel fell for recess, the hallway swallowed the story and began to digest it. Cable producers texted, "Stand by." Bloggers drafted thumbnails. A few defenders rehearsed the script. He was just urging focus. And a few critics drafted the counter. Focus is not an alibi for contempt. The truth would be simpler. Focus without empathy is a scalpel with no hand steady enough to heal. Lunch doesn't change law. It changes energy. People return convinced or converted, dulled or sharpened. Kavanaugh returned to the bench expecting the rhythm to resume. Crockett returned to the microphone ready to rewrite the tempo. The morning had given her the outlines of a door. The afternoon would give her the hinge. Hold the frame in your mind. A laugh, a line about civics, a silence that did not cower. The next 30 seconds you're about to witness will not be an explosion for its own sake. They will be a controlled detonation, targeted, measured, leaving the structure standing but revealing where the load-bearing beams had been miscounted. The smirk would not survive it. The framework might, but only if it became honest enough to weigh 2 hours like it weighs a right. The afternoon light shaved a cleaner edge onto the chamber, and when the gavel called the room back to order, the air had that just-before-impact stillness you feel when a storm reassembles on the horizon. Crockett stepped up with the same unhurried cadence as before, a folder thicker than reputation and thinner than patience. No prologue, no throat clearing. She adjusted the microphone a fraction of an inch, the kind of practical, unshowy movement that says the substance is coming and the rest is scaffolding, and began. Justice. I'd like to return to the operational burdens discussed this morning. She said it as if she were asking to retrieve an item left behind, nothing more. Then she started pulling threads, exhibit tabs in high-contrast ink, timestamps, dockets. She called up Williams vs. Texas like a technician calling up a schematic and read the sentence everyone had quoted and no one had weighed. The 2-hour wait, the court's tolerance, the footnote that treated disparity as a detail, not a defect. She did not accuse. She audited. Kavanaugh reached for the comfort of calibration. Congresswoman, as I said, correlation isn't causation. We can't turn distributions into doctrine without a limiting principle. He meant it as a gate, a reminder that the law is a filter, not a funnel. Crockett nodded as if she'd expected the gate to be there and had already measured the hinge. Limiting principles are exactly what I'm asking about, she said, turning a page. When the record shows a persistent skew, precinct closures clustered in specific zip codes, machine allocation that leaves one side of a city smooth and the other starving, mail-in rejection rates spiking under new signature protocols. What's the limiting principle that prevents neutral on its face from becoming predictably exclusionary in effect? Where do we draw that line with our eyes open? She didn't wave charts. She walked the room through them. County by county, not as spectacle but as proof that the map itself was speaking. She paired wait time medians with staffing logs. She traced the life of a hypothetical voter through actual constraints. A bus that comes on the half hour, a job that docks in quarter hours, a daycare penalty that doesn't prorate. Every number had a clock attached. Every clock had a consequence. She fused the record to live time so tightly that separating them would look like malpractice. Kavanaugh tested a different flank. Even assuming those disparities, the court must avoid becoming a super-election board. Administrability matters. Remedial overreach invites chaos. Crockett had the reply in the folder before the sentence finished. Respectfully, the plaintiff's requested relief is not chaos. It's calibration. Minimum machine-to-voter ratios based on turnout history. Staffing floors that scale with early vote reductions. A mail-in cure process measured in days, not hours, with notice that reaches before rejection locks. These are not wish lists. They're operational specs. If the court can order districts, it can expect districts to order their logistics. She let the silence hold long enough for 2 justices to glance down at the pages she'd cited. Then the next turn, comparative baselines. States with equal or stricter fraud controls have implemented these measures without sacrificing integrity. The record contains cross-jurisdictional data from election cycles before and after adoption. The fraud delta remains statistically negligible. The access delta does not. No flourish. Just the equation laid flat. You can keep safety and fix scarcity if you choose to measure both. He tried the narrow passage of standing. Individual harms do not necessarily scale into constitutional injury. Anecdotes cannot demand architecture. Anecdotes are not my evidence, she said, and the sentence had the pleasant snap of a well-fitted joint. Patterns are documented, repeated, predictable. If 2 hours were randomly distributed across the electorate, your opinion in Williams might read like a tolerable abstraction. But 2 hours clusters. 2 hours knows the names of certain neighborhoods. 2 hours is not a ghost. It's a policy. The last word was an accusation. It was classification. You could feel the room recalibrating. Reporters trained to chase the stanza realized they were watching verse turn into math. Staffers behind council tables stopped tracking faces and started tracking lines. Even the bench leaned subtly. The chief's eyes measured the angles. One justice who'd spent a career in administrative law traced something with a pen and stopped mid-stroke. Kavanaugh returned to doctrine, the place he trusts to hold. Strict scrutiny is not a solvent for complexity. The state's interests are compelling, and uniform rules are a rational means. Crockett didn't contest the premise. She contested the fit. Uniform text with non-uniform outcomes isn't uniform law, she answered. A rational means that repeatedly yields irrational distributions is not rational in practice. The court has long required governments to measure what their rules actually do. The record shows what these rules actually do. Then she pivoted to something deceptively simple. What is the court's tolerance threshold? If 2 hours is not undue, is 3, 4? Or is the answer that the court cannot say because it has declined to weigh the cost where the cost lands? If so, then fundamental has no price cap. It becomes whatever an administrator can make patients endure. It was not a trap question. It was a missing field on a form. For a moment, you could imagine the opinion the bench would have to write to avoid it. How many words it would take to explain why the threshold cannot be quantified, even as the consequences are. You could imagine the footnote that would pretend the clock is beneath the court's notice while the court's name crowns the page. He tried to lighten the weight with a familiar move. Congresswoman, courts decide law, not logistics. Law that refuses to look at logistics abdicates its claim to govern reality, she said. And because she didn't raise her voice, the sentence traveled farther. When the machinery of a right routinely malfunctions in the same places, the malfunction is not incidental to the right. It defines it. Here came the receipts that travel well beyond the day. A short table of jurisdictions that implemented cure notices by text and saw mail-in rejection rates drop without any measurable rise in fraud. A staffing algorithm that reduced average waits across precinct types. A statutory tweak that extended early voting hours in transit-dependent neighborhoods with no litigation spike. Crockett didn't present them as panaceas. She presented them as proof that difficult isn't the same as impossible, and that impossible often means unmeasured. Kavanaugh's fingers tapped the arm of his chair once, twice. He doesn't rattle easily. He wasn't rattled now. He was encountering an argument that refused the usual swap of empathy for evidence and insisted on both. That demands a different kind of answer. He reached for theory. The Constitution's guarantees are structural, not results-oriented. We guard process, not outcomes. She nodded, as if consenting to a stipulation, and then turned it. Process that predictably manufactures exclusion is an outcome by another name. Guarding that process while ignoring its product is like guarding a bridge while ignoring the cars in the river beneath it. The gallery didn't move, but a soundless agreement rippled through rows, lawyers recognizing a turn that would quote well because it argued better. She didn't capitalize the line with theatrics. She moved on, as if the point were obvious and the work unfinished. Then the moment that redrew the center of gravity without a raised decibel. This morning you warned against turning narratives into doctrine. I agree. So let's turn doctrine into measurement. Tell us what evidence, if any, would persuade this court that the burdens here are undue. Specify the metric, specify the threshold, and we will bring you the record. The challenge wasn't daring. It was procedural. It pinned the court to its own promise of neutrality. Neutrality without criteria is discretion in formalware. You could watch the implications spread. If he gave a number, he admitted the court can count time. If he refused, he admitted the court prefers not to. Either answer would tell the public something true. Either answer would pull the robe closer to the world it governs. He didn't answer then. He reached for a restatement. The court cannot constitutionalize every administrative choice. It was safe. It was also smaller than the question asked. Crockett closed a loop. No one is asking you to constitutionalize choices. We are asking you to constitutionalize the right those choices are throttling. A guardrail is not a barricade. A remedy is not a revolution. But a right that survives only as a slogan does not survive at all. No heat. No spike. Just the pressure of facts applied in one direction long enough to reveal where the panel flexes. She let the weight sit. She looked at the bench, not as if to claim victory, but as if to mark the work completed, data presented, doctrine engaged, escape routes mapped. The room felt the shift, the point where confidence surrenders swagger and becomes caution. You could tell by the way counsel for the state shuffled their notes to find lines that would not sound brittle against what had just been lodged in the record. You could tell by the way the cameras, which never move, seemed to lean. Crockett's final move of the round wasn't a flourish. It was a primer for what was coming next. One last question for clarity, she said, voice steady as thread. When we label a right fundamental, is the court willing to articulate the minimum conditions necessary to exercise it in practice? Or will we continue to bless systems that functionally ration participation and call it neutral administration? She left it there, a fork in the transcript the bench would have to choose between. The answer would not come in that moment. The moment's value was different. It welded the abstract to the operational and left no polite space between them. Which is why the next 30 seconds mattered even more. Because when a justice who trusts doctrine more than demonstrations hears the fuse hit the charge, he will either respect the blast's engineering or reach for tone to smother it. And tone here would finally meet its limit. There's a temperature a room reaches just before it changes shape. You don't see it on faces. You feel it in pauses, half-breaths that last one beat longer, a pen that hovers above paper as if waiting for the air to finish its sentence. The chamber was there now. Doctrine had been mapped. Data had been stapled to doctrine. The escape routes were labeled, and still, something essential remained unspoken. The moral hinge the law keeps promising it will consider when properly presented. Crockett reached for it, not as a flourish, but as the final step in a sequence she'd laid like track. She did not preface. She did not soften. She stood as if the microphone were the end of a wire carrying current from outside the building. "Justice Kavanaugh," she said, unhurried. "Since you raised experience this morning, mine and yours, let me ask you about authority. Not legal authority, moral authority." The word moral didn't clang. It settled. It sounded less like accusation and more like inventory. A question about what the court thinks it is carrying when it walks. Kavanaugh shifted. A small adjustment. A weight redistribution familiar to every athlete and advocate who has ever felt a line of attack change angles. "Congresswoman," he began, aiming to preempt, to locate her question inside the safe pen of separation of powers. "This court's authority derives from the Constitution, which calls voting fundamental," she said, finishing his sentence not to score a point, but to hold him inside the frame he'd chosen. "So here is my question. Given your background, your education, your career, your lifetime appointment, and your admitted lack of experience with the ground-level realities of voter suppression, what gives you the moral authority to declare that a 2-hour wait to vote is not an undue burden for people whose lives you have not lived?" There it was. The fuse meeting charge. Not a dare to feel, but a demand to account. The word moral, yoked to authority, forced a translation, from doctrine as architecture to doctrine as shelter. If the building leaks in the same places every time it rains, who keeps signing off on the roof? Silence did what microphones cannot. It stretched, held, then compressed the room into a smaller, truer version of itself. 9 seats, 1 podium, a country listening. Reporters didn't type. They stared. Counsel found their notes suddenly irrelevant. Even the ceiling seemed to lower an inch, the way spaces do when a question lands that no one taught you to dodge. Kavanaugh opened his mouth, and for the first time all day, the words hesitated as if waiting on him rather than him waiting on them. He reached predictably for the doctrine he trusts. "Congresswoman, the court does not claim moral authority. We exercise judicial authority. Our charge is to interpret law, not to ignore consequence." Crockett did not raise a brow. She simply supplied the missing noun. No one is asking you to trade your charge for ours. We are asking who certified your confidence about what 2 hours costs. She let the sentence stand as a mirror. She did not decorate it with outrage. Mirrors don't need decals. This is where lesser advocates break, where they chase the rush, adorn the moment with applause lines, and lose the thread. She did the opposite. She narrowed. You wrote Williams. You tolerated 2 hours as non-undue. The record showed those hours clustered along familiar lines. I'm not asking how you read the statute. I'm asking what, in your lived experience, authorized your certainty about those hours. He tried another route, the institutional shield. The court cannot calibrate law to individual biographies. Then do not calibrate individual biographies to your law, she answered. If you won't weigh the cost, stop pretending you know its weight. The line did not explode. It sank, like something heavy placed exactly where balance requires weight. Everything after that would have been denouement, except she wasn't finished. She lifted a single page from the folder. No stack, no tableau. A document with type that looked ordinary until you remembered where you were standing. For the record, she said, almost conversational, I waited 2 hours to vote in my district last cycle. I brought the time-stamped photo because I knew someone would call that a narrative. A line in the margin, ink, not flourish, marked the hour. She did not hold it up to the cameras. She let the court see it because the transcript would carry the rest. Kavanaugh's jaw set, muscle memory for every person trained to keep composure under public heat. He went to the one move he had left, restate the boundary. Congresswoman, with respect, this is not a forum for personal stories. And yet, she replied, your opinion turned the cost of those stories into doctrine. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't pace. She let the juxtaposition do the work, a jurisprudence that bans narratives, but relies on assumptions about them. A bench that claims neutrality while making declarations about lives it has only measured in footnotes. Then she delivered the sentence that would outlive the day, not because it was viral, but because it was correct. She didn't rehearse it. She released it. Because Justice Kavanaugh, the only thing more dangerous than a judge who doesn't understand the Constitution is a judge who doesn't understand the people it's supposed to protect. No drum roll. No camera cut. Just the clean snap of truth hitting angle iron. You could hear, not sound, but recognition. The way a room recognizes when an argument has been completed rather than merely performed. The line worked because it joined what the court insists are separate, text and life, promise and practice. It worked because it made evasion look like cowardice without calling anyone a coward. It worked because it put the robe back inside the republic that pays for the robe. He blinked. That was all. But it read as shock in a place where micro-expressions are currency. For a beat, he looked not angry, not amused, not superior, just human, confronted by a logic that did not respect the usual exits. His hand moved toward the armrest and stopped. The smirk, which had survived an entire morning and half an afternoon, lost its footing and slid off his face like an old sticker in the rain. Chief Justice Roberts leaned a fraction forward, the way a conductor lifts a hand when a section comes in too hot. The chief was protecting the room, which is his job. Counselor, he started, defaulting to the neutral address the court uses to keep weather out of the transcript. Crockett did not press. She stepped back half an inch, a gesture so disciplined it felt like punctuation. But she had one more sentence, not to scorch the ground but to seal the record. For clarity, I am not questioning the court's power. I am questioning its proximity. If you decline to measure the burdens you declare not undue, you abdicate the only part of neutrality that matters, the part that notices who pays. She closed the folder. That was the gavel in miniature. Kavanaugh found his voice, but it had shed its lacquer. That is an accusation, he said, and the words sounded defensive, as if they had been dragged across gravel before they reached the mic. I take my responsibilities seriously. So do the people who stand in those lines, she answered, and because she spoke without heat, the sentence landed without resistance. She didn't ask the bench to feel. She asked it to stop pretending that feeling and measurement are enemies. Here is what shifted in that 30-second arc, the burden of articulation. Until then, challengers had been asked to specify thresholds the court would accept. Now the court had been challenged to specify any threshold at all. Until then, defenders could rely on the fog of administrability. Now the fog read like an alibi. Until then, tone had been a weapon. Now tone was revealed as insulation, thin, flammable, and finally beside the point. The gallery stayed seated. The guards stayed still. The cameras kept their red eyes open. But the story had already left the building. It was sprinting in a language people recognize, not a treatise, but a test. If the court could say what evidence would persuade it, then this was law. If it could not, then this was theater with citations. Crockett did not bask. She did not wait for the chief to intervene. She returned the page to the folder, aligned the stack, and stepped back from the microphone as if returning a tool to its case. The quiet that followed was not applause. It was a verdict on posture. The bench would continue because benches do. The case would be argued because cases are. But the equilibrium had moved. You could hear it in the way pencils scraped less and pages turned more carefully, in the way counsel measured adjectives before releasing them into air that had just rejected adornment. If you're looking for the secret of the moment, it's not in the line, though the line will be quoted, memed, merchandised, misunderstood. The secret is in the structure. Evidence first, boundaries next, humility demanded last. Most viral moments reverse the order. They open with the zinger and try to backfill meaning. Crockett flipped that script. She built meaning until the zinger wasn't a zinger at all. It was the only possible sentence left. And that is why the smirk did not return. Not because it was scolded, because it was out-argued. Because even a lifetime of altitude cannot keep a sentence aloft when gravity, facts, lives, hours, costs, finally gets its say. It didn't leave the room so much as it escaped, like pressure finding a hairline crack and turning it into a whistle loud enough to stop traffic. Before the ushers finished their practiced sweep, the moment had crossed the marble steps, slid down the handrails, and sprinted into the veins of every platform that measures attention by the millisecond. The first clip hit timelines with bad lighting and perfect timing. The laugh, the question, the line, the stillness. It was enough. Sometimes clarity doesn't need production value. It needs velocity. Phones buzzed on trains, in offices, under desks in classrooms, where civics is still taught like a history unit instead of an ongoing event. Group chats bloomed. Friends who haven't traded messages in months suddenly moving in lockstep. Have you seen this? Watch to 032. No, start at 019. The algorithm did what algorithms do when something feels both inevitable and surprising. It stepped aside. The clip rose on its own. Newsrooms don't move quietly when a frame breaks. Producers barked across glass. Lower thirds multiplied like rabbits. Justice's laugh backfires. Congresswoman's question stuns court. 2 hours on trial. Anchor voices shifted into that elastic register reserved for live storms and elections called at unexpected hours. The language tried on drama, then discovered it didn't need to exaggerate. The tape supplied its own electricity. You could almost hear editorial caution negotiating with audience appetite. Can we run it again? Yes, just once more. Then again, politics metabolized faster. Staffers stitched the clip to emails and watched open rates behave like rocket launches. Fundraising platforms showed numbers that made treasurers rub their eyes. It's not that a single sentence can mint money. It's that a sentence which turns a grievance into arithmetic gives people something to buy into. Supporters who had felt the dull ache of long lines and longer explanations suddenly had a line they could carry. Detractors tried out talking points, tone, decorum, respect for the court. But the tape kept answering back without raising its volume. Memes arrived, because the internet bends toward humor when it doesn't want to admit it has been moved. 3-panel grids, smirk, laugh, blink. Caption writers went to work. Civics class is in session. Correlation just met consequence. Even the earnest borrowed the format. Infographics spread. Bar charts of wait times beside a quote box with a single sentence. If you won't weigh the cost, stop pretending you know its weight. The juxtaposition did what Crockett had done in the room. Glue evidence to rhetoric so tightly that prying them apart looked like bad faith. Cable roundtables filled the evening with heat and some light. A former clerk praised the precision of the question. It didn't ask him to feel. It asked him to specify. A strategist worried aloud about institutional legitimacy. as if legitimacy were porcelain and not muscle. A voting rights organizer, tired and thrilled, said the quiet part. We tell these stories every cycle. Today the story told itself. Somewhere on a panel. Someone invoked both sides and someone else. Less patient than the format prefers, replied. Both sides don't stand in the same line. Inside law schools and bar associations, email chains acquired exclamation points normally reserved for Supreme Court grants. Professors took the clip into classrooms as a case study in advocacy that refuses the false binary between doctrine and life. The exchanges were not about hero worship. They were about method. What happens when you force an institution to name its threshold or admit it doesn't have one? What happens when the robe is asked to quantify what it has long described qualitatively? A few faculty called it grandstanding. More called it a necessary audit. On the Hill, statements arrived on letterhead with astonishing speed. Some glowed, some hedged, few ignored. Veteran members reworded a truth they had learned the hard way. Deference is a currency, and it should not be spent on discounting constituents' lives. A handful of critics tried to paint the exchange as a disrespect of separation of powers. The tape again, calm tone, precise citations, a sentence that challenged proximity, not power. The argument's discipline immunized it against bad faith caricature. In the country, the part commentators call outside, the beltway, as if a freeway could fence in. Concerned, the clip moved differently. In church basements where polling places double as fellowship halls. In union halls where overtime is not a theory, but a mortgage payment. In senior centers where legs tell time more honestly than clocks. The reaction wasn't shock. It was recognition. People nodded at their screens the way you nod when someone finally names the thing you've been trying to describe for years, without getting past the catch in your throat. You could chart the secondary effects. County officials who usually speak in clerical monotone began issuing tentative promises to review machine allocation. A state election board chair, careful as a cat on a wet fence, floated the possibility of expanding cure periods for mail-in ballots. These were not conversions. They were calculations. Administrators feel wind like anyone else. The clip changed the forecast. It made inertia look riskier than adjustment. Inside the court's ecosystem, the shock registered as etiquette rather than headline. The institution's protective reflex kicked in. No comment, no acknowledgement. The marble face turned toward timelessness, while staffers quietly tracked mentions and counted calls. Justices do not answer to trending topics. But clerks read, and the oxygen in chambers is not immune to weather outside. Over the next arguments, questions from one seat, Kavanaugh's, grew shorter, the edges sanded. It wasn't repentance. It was calibration. Even altitude pays attention when the ground rises. Not every ripple was applause. There were op-eds scolding Crockett for performative prosecutorial rhetoric, as if literature had abducted law. There were stern pieces about erosion of norms, penned by people whose norms rarely require them to stand in lines that outlast lunch breaks. But even those critiques were forced to quote the sentence, and the sentence did not wilt when transplanted into disapproval. Its architecture held. The viral spread birthed 1,000 smaller acts. Local activists clipped the clip into town hall slides. High school teachers inserted it into lesson plans, asking students to define undue burden with their own thresholds and to defend them. A city council member in a mid-sized county drafted a resolution for machine-to-voter ratios, citing the exchange as impetus. A bus driver union lobbied for extended early vote hours to match routes they knew too well. None of these actions solved the whole problem. All of them treated the problem as real.